Is the home inspection a step in the buying process that buyers and investors can afford to just skip? Maybe the reality of paying for a home inspection for a property that you don't end up buying has you thinking twice. And you're reading online about the pressure to waive every contingency under the sun, especially the inspection one, if you want the chance to have your offer be accepted. And this is even more pressure for investors. So in today's video, I'm going to cover the tips to get the most out of hiring a professional home inspector. Imagine not thinking about that home inspection report, which quite frankly is usually 40, 50 pages, as a document that you'll never look at again, but one that's going to give you tremendous leverage in your negotiating process. A professional home inspector can not only help you avoid surprises, but that can give you a more thorough, complete assessment of the property and therefore what you're getting yourself into as a homeowner or an investor. So today I'm going to be sharing a conversation I had with one of my go-to home inspectors. We share a lot of pearls of wisdom about really how to get the most value out of the experience or around your due diligence in your buying process. So before we get started, I'm Veronica Woods. This is the Real Estate Wisdom channel, where we give tips about buying and selling properties in the Philadelphia and Delaware County area, as well as give tips about building a more profitable rental property portfolio. So let's dive right into this conversation. Hi, I have with me one of my favorite home inspectors to kind of just talk about how to get the most value out of the home inspection and how using the data that you can collect from the home inspection can be really helpful in making decisions long down the road if you're an investor. So let me let Ross introduce himself. Ross, tell my audience a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Veronica. Sure. I own Kennedy Home Inspections. It's a LLC in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I've done it since 2014, and it's just me. I kept my private practice just for one man only, me. So I like to do it that way simply because when you pick up the phone and want quicker results, you don't have to go through a whole lot of people. I schedule, I do the inspection, I write the report, I follow up. It's just the way I've chosen to do business, but it's been successful for me for all these years, almost 10 now.
Yes, I've enjoyed working with you. Like I said, you're one of my go-to home inspectors. You've inspected my properties that I've owned as well as for my clients. And what I like best about you, which is why I invited you to one of my online discussions, is you kind of tell the truth and kind of get right to the point with my clients about what's going on in the property. And I know, a challenge today, for all this technology, sometimes people think they can skip the home inspection because they can see a lot of information online. What do you say to clients thinking that way?
There is almost never a time where I do an inspection for someone where something isn't found that they would never have found by looking online. We'll start with that, but I would say that even beyond that, there are many people who by the end of the inspection look at me and go, I can't believe I considered skipping this inspection because something was found that was of such importance or relevance. And again, it may not be something that's impossible to fix, but large enough that had they purchased the house without an inspection and then found out, that would have been a particular concern for them. So yeah, that's kind of the thing that I feel not vindicated. What's the right word? I feel like my job is of value more when I get to be that person who helps your client avoid that pitfall or avoid that mistake or that costly purchase that not that they wouldn't purchase it, but that they need to know it into the negotiating phase of purchasing the house.
Yeah, no, we were just talking before we started recording about a time where I had an out of state investor and she picked the property because it looked like it was occupied. And from the photos, it looked like it was nothing but just minor cosmetic repairs. But when we walked in the property, the smell that hit us when we walked out to the basement, I will
Oh,
never
I
forget.
remember. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We talk about that a bunch. It's easy to put up a property online and make it look a certain way, and it's not that it's being deceptive, but you can only see so much with a picture. And then once you get into the property, I think, like I told you before we started this broadcast, I've been in homes where there's raw sewage running through basements and tenants are living in them. That's an extreme example, but just because people are currently living in a property doesn't mean there aren't some significant findings that we need to uncover with a home inspection.
Now, are you finding that some sellers are asking for inspections? I know in other parts of the country, it seems to be more common, like in the DC area, but in Pennsylvania, it's kind of hit or miss where some sellers may feel like maybe I need to get an inspection before I put it on the market so I can be totally transparent about what's going on in the property. What have you
Yeah,
seen?
I mean, my probably maybe 5% of my work would be pre-listing inspections for the seller. I find that it's usually someone who's a pretty organized person who doesn't want surprises, maybe a more mature person in terms of age, just doesn't want the hassle of putting a house on the market and then hearing from the buyer all the things that could be wrong with their house. So it really is a multi-part inspection in the sense that we do the pre-listing, we get the inspection done, then they have the opportunity to fix everything before it goes on the market or fix most things. It's also a defense for the seller in case for some reason the buyer comes in with an inspector who's way outside the scope of what he should be doing. Especially if a house is in mint or perfect condition, they might start, most inspectors don't do this, but it can happen where they'll start to pick at things that don't really belong on an inspection report. And the seller then has an opportunity to call me back in with my report and my knowledge of the house and give them a bit of a defense and say, that isn't something that's relevant, or the other guy's wrong, that kind of thing. So it really gives a peace of mind to the seller to put their best house forward by doing a pre-listing inspection.
Yeah, I mean, as someone even representing a buyer, if I'm able to see a previous inspection, that does definitely help the kind of the negotiating process because everything's up front. So, like you said,
Right.
there's not a lot of surprise. But sometimes there's people who go in, especially investors. I work a lot with investors, and they may want to be able to say they're purchasing the property as is and as is condition. And a
Sure.
lot of times, there's people try to become lawyers as realtors and try to like explain what that means, but
Right.
clear the hotline says that as it said, doesn't mean that you don't get an inspection. So if
Right.
you could kind of just speak to when you're working with a client who tell you like, hey, I can't negotiate repairs, but I just want to know the property, what I'm getting into. How do you approach the inspection for those people?
So you're talking specifically about investors who are coming in?
Investors, or like you said, it's an as is sale. So they're really not going to be in the position to negotiate repair
Gotcha.
items.
Yeah. So, fortunately for me, I don't have the hard job that you do, where you have to negotiate these things. My
Right.
job is to give information, and I try to give the information that's going to put the buyer in a position of knowledge. So, the information that they get, it's the truth. The house tells the story. And that can be a hardship sometimes because sometimes I'm given information that's going to make that deal a lot harder to make go through. But my job is to give the information, and so to equip and impart information to the buyer with delicacy is kind of the key, right? So not everything out there is as bad as it seems when I first say it. And I think the relevance of what I say is important, but it also how how I give the information is key, because you don't want to overstate or understate a particular problem, but you're handing over information about a property to a potential buyer or investor that they in turn take to you, to the realtor, and then take to the negotiating table. So if we're talking about an as-is property, and they already know that the seller's not going to do anything to fix the things that I'm discovering, then they have the opportunity, and I don't encourage one way or the other, to walk away from the deal, or to consider, and I do give price estimates with my work if needed or asked for, and they could look at this thing they've got, this property, and they list the list of things that are necessary to fix to make it a flip or a purchase or whatever they're going to do with it, and have an educated guess on what they're going to be in for, in terms of expense. And the good thing about the end of the inspection and report is that it's not over. We continue to discuss with the client. The report itself is written in a way that delineates between the major and minor defects, but sometimes clients really want to know, but what do I need to get to first? What do I really need to hit? What's the key elements of what you've given me here? And that's always open for discussion. I don't give too much contract advice, though I was a contractor previously to being a home inspector, but that's outside of my lane technically. But where I can, I try to assist the buyer in understanding, all right, what do you got here? What are you going to be expected to make this thing livable or safe? And they can make the choice ultimately to purchase it and know what they're in for, or unfortunately sometimes to walk away.
And how is the delineation between major and minor defects? I never know. Is it an art form, or is it like I never forget, I had one of my early home inspections outside of Pennsylvania in New Jersey, but the home inspector put adequate.
Yeah. Right.
And that adequate haunted me as I had to redo my plumbing between floors. So I always kind of wanted to understand what is the kind of line between just barely passing to really being a major defect. Right.
So and most realtors know, and anyone watching this video who's been in the real estate, probably knows that all home inspectors write different types of reports, right? They're essentially the same, but that specific delineation or clarification on major, minor, needs attention, can wait, are all written differently. So unfortunately for you all, you work with different inspectors, you probably have to translate their reports a little bit differently, which maybe isn't the best thing. I've actually way simplified that process. So my reports have a front summary page which lists the major defects. Everything else is a minor defect, and it's in the bulk of the report. So some may say that's oversimplification, but for me, a major defect comes down to, is it expensive to fix? Is it, and by expensive, it's relative. I get it. But I think when a $10,000 sewer line break is an expensive fix, or or equally $10,000 or $15,000 worth of knob and tube wiring through a whole property. Those things are clearly expensive fixes. What would qualify as an inexpensive fix would be a simple GFCI outlet in a bathroom or something like that, or even little bits of those things lined up together don't amount to a huge major expense. But a shift in a foundation, or something subsidence of the house where you're going to have to underpin the house, clearly a major defect. Now that's one category, the expense. For me, another way of looking at a major defect would be, is it unsafe? Is it going to cause you physical harm in some way, or is the house in some risk because this thing exists? So that could be mold. Mold is listed as a major defect. Now, the important clarification is major defects don't mean unfixable. It just means that there's a little bit more to be done to make it fixable. I mean, even a sinking house can be fixed, right? So the reality is a major defect is something that you're going to be, it needs to get done for you to safely occupy that property. Or when it gets done, it could be really expensive. So that's really the two criteria I use for a major defect versus a minor. And I think, there's some dispute in the industry about this. And I think some realtors are maybe expecting some of the things that I find to be bumped up to a major defect, if for no other reason than it helps the negotiating process. And I'm not opposed to negotiating myself on some of these items. If they're going to cause a headache in the real estate transaction and they're considered by the buyer and possibly even the realtor as something that's more important than I'm suggesting it is, we can talk about that, and work that out in the wording of the report and so forth. We stay honest to what's true about the problem, and we don't fabricate anything, but sometimes wording is the key, right? So, honestly, this is an industry where emotions run high, particularly with buyers, and they may look at a particular problem that they consider a major defect, but in essence, the reality of the scenario is that it's not. But we do the best we can to appease and tell the truth, but do it in a way that helps the buyer get what they need as well.
Now, you said something important about just like the words on the home inspection, because I think because sometimes the emotion of leaving a home inspection and maybe one word you said orally kind of is ringing in their minds and they want me to go to battle over that thing, which is in essence was a minor thing.
Yeah.
And I tell them, like, I really need to cut and paste from the home inspector, or let's say if a follow-up contractor went in and gave an estimate, in the negotiations, the experts in housing construction, your opinion matters more than mine, because you're my facts or data as far as the back and forth. So
yeah,
that's good to kind of understand that the impact of the words that you're putting in the report, and you're very careful in your word choice for that reason.
Right. And I would just say that if there was anything misspoken on an inspection, and we're all guilty of saying something that might just spark that one little fear in the buyer, right? So clarification is key. Always have the buyer come back to me, to the inspector, to the contractor, maybe even, and if you feel as though they have an exaggerated sense of the problem unnecessarily, we can always circle back with the client and clarify it better.
Okay.
As needed.
Now, I guess speaking of that, what do you wish buyers would ask you more about during the home inspection? Because they have your attention for, an hour and a half, sometimes 3 hours, depending on the size of the property. What do you wish that they would ask you more while they're in the inspection?
That's a really good question, because the personalities of those who attend inspections are obviously all over the spectrum, right? You got those who sit on a sofa and wait for you to finish, and you wonder why they came to the inspection, and then you got the ones who are asking endless questions, which I don't mind, except that those questions often really not often, at times they will dwell on the irrelevant. And you have to, obviously our job is to be there for them. They're our paying client. The information is for them. And I'm actually thrilled when a buyer or a client attends the inspection and has a vested interest in it. It kind of bothers me when they're there to not be there with me. But that's a part of the job. That's just the way it goes. I often have to remind myself that the questions that they're asking come from a place of naivety or ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance and stupid, I mean ignorance in the sense that they just don't understand houses the way inspectors are trained to understand houses. So when they continually ask questions about items that they're concerned about, a simple crack in a wall that I've already looked at, or why is the cabinet crooked, the face of the cabinet crooked, I'll field those questions because I realize that's where they are. But I would feel when they ask those questions and yet are totally disinterested when I'm explaining the heat system to them, that's concerning to me. So when you ask what I wish they would ask, I wish they would let me guide them, because I know what's going to end up costing them a lot of money in the future if something weren't working. And there are certain systems in a home that are clearly more important than others. Sometimes they're there just to see, do I need to paint this room? Or, what about the paneling on the wall in this room? And yeah, it may be ugly and it may not be something you want, but that's not really what my value here represents. My value is to tell you, you've got an HVAC system that's from 1983, and it's got this problem and it's got that, but I've lost you because now I'm into technical stuff. And I won't say that people aren't interested in their HVAC. I think of all the things that they come to want to know about, they want to know how old is their heat system, and roofs and stuff like that. So I may be exaggerating this a bit, but if they would trust the inspector to know what's key for them, and where to focus, because we're looking at it all, and it may be hard for the buyer to truly understand that we see it. Sometimes they get ahead of you, and they're looking at a broken window that's in a room you're not even in yet. And you want to establish with them that they can trust you to see the whole house, and we're going to get to every inch of it. We may not touch every inch, but we see every inch of a home. Sometimes we see parts of homes that they'll never go into, crawl spaces and attics and so forth. So I guess that would be the answer, is that they would trust the inspector to not only see it all, but to impart the information about the most important systems, over top of the cosmetic items.
Yeah, and quite honestly, that's true for the investors as well, who definitely aren't going to live in the property. But I think when people dream of buying investment property, they think about upgrading for their ideal tenant, and a lot of times it's cabinets and painting. And I usually try to narrow or kind of nudge them to can you follow Ross, because you're paying him to be here, and this is a really important time. So,
yes, yeah.
So I sense that as well, and it's an opportunity to learn. If you're a new investor, I always attend the inspections, because I learn as well too about learning about the house, and the more that you spend time side by side with somebody who's really expert in the house, the more, the better you'll understand the next inspection.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So the last question I guess I wanted to ask just is around some misunderstood defects, because you kind of alluded to, there's things people look at, like a crack in the wall may not always be, oh my God, let me get out of this deal. But then there's some things, some about the older homes. Most of them are really associated with the older homes that we have in this area and what that means, especially if people are living in a newer home themselves, or in that part of the country, they have more newer homes. There's certain things that freak people out when you mention it on the home inspection report. So I just kind of wanted to know what your kind of top defects that you see that people should be more worried about. Not worried about in the sense of, like you said, everything is solvable, but okay, we really want to understand these particular problems more.
Sure. So if you're talking about a standard, say, Philadelphia row home, you're talking about a home that was built someplace between early 1900s to 25, 30, right? And that's talking about the majority of a lot of the homes. So you're talking about a home that's going to have several generations of people living in them, and they're going to have defects to them that are just a result of age. So there are going to be those buyers who probably should just be looking at new houses, because they have a hard time looking past what happens to a house over 100 years, And now, that isn't to say that old is just character. Sometimes old is bad, Sometimes
So everything is in good bones then. Like
Right,
that's the
exactly.
marketing term, good
Yeah,
bones.
right. And I mean, they were built well, but sometimes that front brick wall starts to bow out, and sometimes the joists on the floors do start to sag to a point where you need to deal with it. You know, but the important distinction for a home inspector is to determine when old becomes beyond character and when it becomes a problem. And are you inheriting this house now on the timeline of its decay, for lack of a better term, that now you're going to be the owner when that thing eventually has gotten old enough that it needs to be dealt with? A floor can only sag so long before it becomes something that eventually someone's going to have to fix, right? So, and I don't know if I'm getting to the heart of your question, but I do notice that people come into these houses with sort of the expectation that plaster walls are going to look just like a brand new drywall, and they're just not. And the second floor of some of these homes is always going to have a little dip at the top of the steps. But and that's because of age and the way the joists work and the stairwell cut out and all that kind of thing. So, in essence, my job is to help them see that you're buying a house that's 100 years old and it has physical defects, or deformities, I guess I would say, but they may not be defects. They might be, but we have to determine that during a home inspection, that if we're at a point now where there's enough evidence that this thing has done this thing so much that now we need to get a structural engineer or some kind of contractor out there to take a further, more invasive look at it, then we do that. People come in freaking out about roofs. Roofs are pretty cheap to fix, especially flat roof homes in Philadelphia. They obviously, you don't want a leaking roof. That's probably the most important thing on the top of a house. So the idea is, they're terrified over a leaking roof, but sometimes it's a simple patch or a simple replacement of the flat roof, which isn't that expensive.
No, but you're touching. I guess I wanted to just to get your mind thinking further. So you basically framed it how I wanted to talk about, like, it's 100-year-old house. Okay, so there are some things that are just natural that comes with that.
Yes.
And I like the way you mentioned it in terms of you're coming in on the 115-year journey.
Right.
And are you willing to take on that very common 115-year-old house problem? So like the roof, I guess the big scary thing a lot of people get caught up on is that knob and tube wiring. So every time I do a home inspector, I'm holding my breath for you to say,
I know.
Is there an active knob and tube?
I know.
So if you can speak a little bit about, kind of how you find it, how it's potentially remedied and how you kind of put it in perspective for your clients going through the inspection.
And this is an interesting question, Veronica, because it actually, the nature of this conversation changes from the city limits to the suburbs, or as I've found. Because it's so prevalent within the city, there still is, I think, a sense that knob and tube can be dealt with. It can, the quick concerns of knob and tube are that it can be inherently unsafe for a multitude of reasons, and it might not be insurable. The general gist in the nature of in the industry is that it is almost too hard to get insured now. But again, I keep hearing information from one end to the other about whether or not that's true. So I don't really get involved in all of that. My particular perspective on knob and tube comes from a safety standpoint. So I'd like to see all knob and tube eliminated, for instance, but it doesn't necessarily have to be if an electrician comes in and works on it and deems it safe. So I don't want to get outside too much of what I do in terms of whether or not it has to go, but I do recommend that all knob and tube should be removed. But how I find it we do a visual, non-destructive home inspection, right? So I can't rip open walls, I can't bust through ceilings, but I spend some time starting in the basement, looking in the ceiling joists of the basement. I look at the electrical panel. I'll pop off a faceplate here or there throughout the property and look behind it to see if there's wiring in there, this knob and tube. Sometimes if there's drop ceiling, you can look above that, and if there's this knob and tube wiring hanging down, connected to the light fixture, that's a clear way. And then any attic I can get into is the number one place where you might find it. I sort of cover my bases with this one. I suggest that even if I don't see it, the house is from 1923. It's very possible that it still exists in there. And then, also any ungrounded outlets could be an indicator of knob and tube wiring. There's a bunch of different ways to look for it without getting too invasive. But it's one of those things where the client has to make a choice. I know somebody recently who flipped a house who knew knob and tube was there. They flipped it. They didn't fix it. Nobody ever asked a question. Apparently the insurance didn't care, and he sold the house. Do I think that's a good idea? No. It's what happens if that house burns down? Is the insurance company really going to pay out? Knob and tube is a brittle wire. It's the sheathing is probably old and worn. When it connects to new wiring, it becomes an overheat risk. Is it the end of the world? Absolutely not. Does it come with a certain cost to replace? Yeah, sometimes quite a bit, but it's just like anything else that's found on a home inspection. Everything's repairable, right? Mm-hmm. So how much if there's any indication that there might still be knob and tube left over on a property, we always elevate that to an electrician who knows what he's doing, and we'll be able to search for it completely and eliminate it. Does that answer the question?
That's helpful.
Yeah.
I guess, and there's a defect that usually municipality, especially you mentioned the difference between the suburbs and the city, but curbing is always like a big, could be small expense, but surprise that maybe is something that you may have noticed in the home inspection as minor, but then when the township inspector comes out, they're like, this has to be fixed at a certain time.
Sure.
And if you could just touch on kind of like the difference between your inspection and kind of keeping track of these different township codes and
yeah, it's impossible. So we have our inspections are guided by what's called the standards of practice, and they come out from our trade associations that we belong to. So I belong to ASHI, American Society of Home Inspectors. They kind of dictate the lane that I stay in, of what I'm looking at, and where you become a better inspector is when you become a little bit more familiar with the various townships that you're in. For instance, I know that when I'm in Rose Tree, which is a section out near Media, Pennsylvania, they require the sellers there to do a sewer lateral scope. Some other townships are adopting that same policy. It's good to kind of know that and play off the realtor with what they know about it as well. But then you got the city licenses. In Philadelphia, you've got L&I. And I have to try to understand that my role is not to know all of the code and the different enforcement that the townships are getting. I'm not a code enforcer, but they are, so I can be of help in some ways to suggest that, oh, well, hey, we're in Philly. We know they're going to call this out, but I don't always get that right. And I certainly don't have an exhaustive list of whatever these townships are going to be calling. And some, literally, the township inspector will drive by and get a reading of the sidewalk and the rails, and that's it. But other townships will go in, they'll check GFCIs, they'll look at this and that. So we got a lot of municipalities around here, and they're all different. So I would like to say that I could be of help making my inspection report and theirs jibe, but I can't always do that.
No, that's important to note that that's researched. Either the buyer or the realtor, if you're used to, like, for the towns that I normally work in, I know what the hot buttons are because I've walked with those inspectors, so I know. Yeah. But it is helpful to kind of make sure you're looking at those things while you're in the house, or at least have a discussion with kind of comparing reports afterwards, so that you can make that determination.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
important.
Yeah. And I can certainly help to clarify, if the township guy comes in and says, this has got to get done. I mean, a loose handrail is a loose handrail. It's unsafe for me, but it's a code thing for him, right? So,
Right. Right. Yeah, that's another one of the handrails, curbing, and there's times where we go back and like, is this the crack they're talking about?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So and then that my report, and just for clarification, is something that's provided to the client, but nobody ever has to do anything about what I say, right? When the townships come in and they send their code enforcers in, those items typically have to get done for their buyer to get a certificate of occupancy. So there's a little bit of a difference, in the weight of what I say versus the weight of what they say.
Right. And I guess we should add the third group, the bank. So if they're getting a loan, then the appraiser has a checklist. Now, the appraiser is generally not a contractor, so it's always kind of a gray area.
Right.
But if they see an obvious water stain, it's safe to say there's some kind of water damage. They can feel confident in that. I don't know, how much do you get into thinking about, okay, my client's getting an FHA loan, so I need to look at this, or a conventional loan?
Generally, the rules for those are pretty cut. Well, that's not true. So, it used to be, it's an FHA, we know we need to get a termite inspection. But it seems like those rules keep changing and shifting. So it's always a question, if it's a VA loan, FHA loan, or even an FDA. I think there's something else, more about those than I do. But if I know that it's that type of loan, and I don't always know that up ahead of time, but usually it comes up during conversation, then I'll double back and I said, well, wait a minute. Now that I know this is FHA, I need to ask the certain questions. Did you get the radon done? Did you get the termite done? Is there other certifications or paperwork that I need to fill out to satisfy the lender? Where with a conventional loan, I don't need to ask those questions.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I think I try to bring it up if I'm there, because I'm looking, let's say if they're on the line of they want to get a conventional loan, even, it has to be habitable. So any major safety issue would put the loan in question if the seller is not willing to make the repairs. So I definitely, going back to the as-is sale. So I've had deals where it's as-is sale, the buyer's getting a conventional loan, and then the seller has to be educated that doesn't mean that if they need to do repair to make the loan go, that they're still not obligated, or they have to make that very clear. And sometimes it's like, well, as soon as we saw this roof damage,
right,
your roof damage,
yeah.
Now that is a defect that you're just going to have to fix, Mr. Seller, if you want my client to get the money. So knowing that at the inspection, kind of changes how the negotiations go, because like, we don't have to negotiate this like this. Sure. If you want him to get the money and pay you X, you have to do that repair.
Yep. That makes sense. Yep.
So I think a lot of it comes down to the more conversation about how the buyer plans to use the property and what matters to them up front. Then you can kind of approach your process to make sure that they get what they need to be able to make the deal go, right? That's
correct. Yeah, that's right. It's all about information, right? That's what we're there for, is to gather. And like I said at the beginning, the house tells the story. You don't have to create a narrative that doesn't exist. That you just tell. My job is a storyteller, and and to tell the proper story about the condition of the property they're considering. And it always, becomes a temptation of the inspector, and I know the realtor, to empathize with the buyer and to want to make their life easier. But from the perspective of a home inspection, my job is to give the information that helps and it might not help them buy the house, but it might help them know what they should do. And I can't ever be the judge of what they can manage or what their threshold of information might be. Some people are handy and they don't get worried about certain things. Other people are terrified of a nail pop in a ceiling. You manage these things from an emotional standpoint. I have a psychology background too, Veronica.
Oh, okay. Like the emotion of
and a teaching background. Yeah, you have to tailor your information giving to the client you're with, and we always have a conversation prior. Well, I mean, I typically have a conversation with a realtor prior to a meeting. Where are these people at in their heads? Are they nervous? And it's not a judgment or any denigration of any kind of people group or emotional type of person. It's how do you want to best give them information so that they can hear it? And we keep everybody level headed about the information. So it's good to be more than just dumping a report on someone and dumping the information. It's an interchange of communication with the client that goes on at whatever level they want to have that. So.
No, that's a good point. I think also, I guess the last of the ad is about kind of like setting expectations. So I'm definitely, as a realtor, you should ask your realtor, like, okay, what do you think potentially the home inspector may see with the house? And especially if it's an old house. So it's kind of like, this is an old house.
Yeah.
It's not a perfect house. Or if I know that the seller hasn't lived there. So they probably, their seller's disclosure. So we didn't reference that. So in Pennsylvania, the sellers have to fill out a seller's disclosure and go 10, 11 pages and state what they know about the house. Inevitably, they miss stuff because they can kind of plead, oh, I didn't know. Yep. But when it's an older house and they haven't lived there, or just tenants have lived there, that the likelihood of their getting all the information is lower, and there's probably something wrong. So I'm always like, we're bracing for what we can't see.
Correct.
That only the inspector's eye was going to be able to make apparent. And so you go in with that, like, not like, oh, it's perfect.
Yeah.
He's going to say, perfect house. Good job. He's not going to say that. Like, that's never happened to me. So there's always going to be something wrong. And so that helps. Yeah,
the disclosure statement is handy, but it's often wrong from my perspective, or it's just completely unhelpful from what you're saying. If it's an estate sale, people don't know, it's actually, I don't want to disparage it. It is a handy tool if it's filled out properly, but I don't use that to guide me in any way unless unless I just can't come up with an age of a boiler, for instance. And if I can't, they probably can't either, because there's no serial number or there's no information, then they probably don't know that it's 30 or 40 years old or older. If they don't know how old a roof is and they don't indicate that, or no, if I can't figure out how old a roof is, but they know that it was put in 2015, that's handy, helpful information. So it's an interplay between what I learn, but I don't take as gospel truth the information necessarily written down on a disclosure statement, because people are fallible and they do the best they can. I'm not suggesting that they're being deceptive in any way, but they often just don't know. I'll be honest, I was a contractor and a home inspector. I don't know how old my roof is. I really wish I did, because it's getting older, but people don't often write that stuff down. So I always take the information that a disclosure statement can give me, but the definitive statement that I leave with the buyer is my own observation.
I guess the other thing is if there were permits. So
sure.
that's
very helpful
thing.
Yep.
Again, a lot of times people like, I'm not sure. I know I didn't get one, but I'm not sure exactly when the repair was done, or I think the previous homeowner did termite treatment and, things like that. I don't know if any advice when there isn't permits, but let's say the work looks okay, but there's not a permit. You know,
Yeah, that's risky because if you're talking about moving a load bearing wall without a permit, now what do you do? So the the inspection may not detect an immediate problem. What if the job was done a month ago? There's no chance yet for the defect to have occurred. But that a load bearing wall was moved without a permit. Now you have to, unfortunately, the limit of what I can do is to express in a report that no permitted work was found, a load bearing wall was moved, no physical defects were noted at the day of inspection. Monitor this, or it's incumbent upon the seller or buyer to come up with a contractor who's going to do some kind of work to determine, or even a structural engineer. I mean, I'm doing an extreme case here,
okay.
But if someone's going to buy a house with no proof of permit on something that was done that was significant, they now inherit that problem, even if it's a problem that doesn't show up for a year or two. So permitted work on major projects is kind of key. Now, there are ways I know it's not easy, but sometimes you can go to an office somewhere, a township office or something. It's probably a little bit different in Philadelphia, to see if there had been permitted work, even though the seller doesn't have an actual copy of it. But that's risky, and if we're ever at a situation at the end of an inspection where we have more questions, that's the best I can do, is just suggest to them, we have more questions. And I know that makes more work for the realtor, and I know that makes more work for everybody else, but what am I going to do? Not tell them? There's a question mark here, and I've hit the limit of what I can do on the scope of a home inspection to answer that question. Now we need to take it to the next level. If ultimately you go through all the levels you can exhaust and you don't have the answer to that, the buyer has to make a choice, and they have to make a choice whether they'll just deal with the consequences or they'll walk away from it because they don't know. It's, I have to, as a home inspector, release that, not worry about that. It's more important that I unfortunately dump it on the laps of you all and tell you this is where we are. But it's better that people know where they stand rather than be surprised later. Because as you might know, if they're not told, that's when litigation starts, and people start saying, hey, why wasn't I told that this load bearing wall was removed without a permit? Don't like to go down that road, but that's what could happen.
Wow, we really did cover a lot in that conversation. I do want to go over 2 more takeaways before we wrap up the video. 1, the real value of a home inspection is really getting that overall assessment of the health of the property. This is not the same as putting together a cosmetic punch list, right? So you're hiring a home inspector to really assess does the house have good bones, good character, or is this a bad house, as Ross mentioned on the video? And I thought it was interesting that a home inspector may go into areas of the house that the owner may never in a lifetime of owning the property go into. And that was really kind of eye-opening to think about, and a reality for a lot of homeowners. The second point is that all home inspectors are not equal. There's some that really can grab on to the different, or explaining and communicating the nuance to what they see and giving proper perspective so that you as a buyer can take that information and make meaningful decisions. As a realtor, I've seen that home inspectors that have prior construction experience can offer really a lot of value in the due diligence process for my clients. Now, speaking of getting experience or the right people on your team, you'll want to watch the video that's appearing on your screen now that's talking about how not to hire the wrong lender for your buying process. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy investing.